Yorkshire, England, 1738. A 10-year-old farm boy begins a journey that will make him the greatest explorer in history. To many, this will make him a hero. To others, a villain. He is Captain James Cook. By 1769, James Cook is leading Britain's first great scientific voyage of discovery. He's already crossed the vast Pacific Ocean, finding new peoples, new cultures, searching for the fabled southern continent his masters think will make Britain the most powerful nation on Earth. I've been on a journey of my own, following in Cook's footsteps. Not so much to find out what he did. I want to know what made him tick, who he really was, why he did what he did. New Holland, the Great Barrier Reef. Around 11 p.m, June the 11th, 1770. Endeavour smashes into the jagged coral. If Cook can't get his ship off the reef, they'll all face certain death. Water gushes in. The men throw stores, cannon, food overboard, anything to lighten the ship. They're 32 kilometres from land. 100 lives hang in the balance. After more than 23 terrifying hours bailing water, they manage to float her off the reef. But water's still pouring in. Then one of the sailors has an idea.
A midshipman, Jonathan Monkhouse, remembered a technique called fothering, where you slide a sail under the ship and wrap it up like a bandage covering the wound. Monkhouse's idea saves everyone's lives, at least for the moment. It's brought them a few precious days, but they're not out of danger yet.
Endeavour limps for 3 days towards the coastline. James Cook's watching plumes of smoke rising from the land. Smoke means people. People only settle where they can find fresh water. Like so many times in his life, fortune now smiles on James Cook. He finds a wide, shallow waterway that he names Endeavour River. Today, the nearest city is Cairns. For James Cook, it's a 5-week journey from Botany Bay up the Australian coast to here. It takes me 3 hours. Now, looking down onto the Great Barrier Reef, it's amazing he made it this far north at all. He's picked his way through a treacherous coral reef stretching the same distance as London to Moscow.
The place where James Cook brought Endeavour is now called Cooktown. It's pretty remote. It's about 300 kilometres north of the nearest city, located way up high on the Queensland coast. The main road to Cooktown was only paved in 2006. Before that, it was just a dirt track that turned to mud in the rainy season. But then, Cooktown's always been isolated. In 1770, when the Europeans were here, it might just as well have been on another planet.
Over 16,000 kilometres from Britain, and nobody back home has a clue where they are.
James Cook pulled Endeavour in right here. By now, the place was deserted. Whoever had lit those fires was long gone. We know from his records that he beached the ship right here, in this exact spot, and then pulled her up onto the mud, pushed her over to repair the hole in her side. Sidney Parkinson, the ship's artist, then rowed out roughly to where those boats are out there, turned around and drew the scene. Carpenters start the desperate business of repairing Endeavour's hull with whatever materials they can find. No one knows if their ship will ever make it back to England. Endeavour's the only means of survival for her crew, but she's also a treasure ship. There are observations from the transit of Venus, the first ever charts of Tahiti and New Zealand, and the thousands of unique natural history specimens collected by Joseph Banks and his fellow scientists. If James Cook can't find a way home, all these will be lost to history.
What is so surprising about Cook is that he's managed all the rest of the voyage without doing this. He's managed to avoid running aground Tahiti, all the way around New Zealand, most of the way up the east coast of Australia, in and out of the Barrier Reef. Remarkable. He's making the charts as he goes, and he manages to run aground just once. That's absolutely stunning.
It speaks volumes for his capabilities as a leader that he's actually able to pull the situation around and bring his men to safety. Perhaps other leaders might have struggled at this point.
James Cook and his crew spend nearly 2 months here at Endeavour River, a strange, mysterious land with even stranger creatures.
It was of a light mouse colour and the full size of a greyhound with a long tail. In short, I should have taken it for a wild dog, but for its walking or running in which it jumped like a hare or a deer. It bears no resemblance to any European animal I ever saw.
Eventually, the men managed to catch and shoot one of these strange-looking animals. Sidney Parkinson then made a drawing of it. It was the first kangaroo ever seen by Europeans. But notwithstanding that, after Sidney had finished, they still went ahead and ate it.
They're not the only Australians James Cook meets. He finally contacts the elusive Aborigines. Sidney Parkinson draws them. At first, things go well, but the white men's need to store food for the long trip home creates tension.
They sit down at fires together. It's friendly. But what happens is that I think Cook and his crew take too much. Aboriginal people come aboard the Endeavour, for example, and they see that 12 sea turtles have been captured for food for the crew. And they're very troubled by this.
The local Aboriginal people basically wanted their share, which is a part of Aboriginal life. You know, you've caught our turtles, we expect to take some back, and possibly something else. Cook and his crew made it quite plain that that wasn't going to happen, so there was a breakdown in those relationships very quickly.
Eric Dirrell is from the Gugu Yimithirr tribe who met James Cook. They still have their stories from that time.
It got to the stage where your people had set fire to the British camp, but then Cook himself fired and shot one of your people in the leg.
That's right. The purpose of setting that fire is that they were disappointed that there was none of this caring and sharing things. They had that many turtles on deck, and that was a shock to our people.
It must have been a diplomatic nightmare in some ways, because it's easy for us now, with the knowledge that we have, if you're encountering a different group, to go in and respect those people. But Cook wouldn't have known that.
I believe that Cook wanted to patch his boat up and then leave the area because he didn't expect that this was going to happen. And the way he acted was good, and that saved the life of his crew. And if he wasn't so diplomatic about this, or understandable, we wouldn't have this history.
Again, Cook narrowly avoids death. He spends 7 frustrating, fascinating weeks at Endeavour River, and despite the occasional fight, the locals make a deep impression on him.
They may appear to be the most wretched people on Earth, but in reality, they're far more happier than we Europeans. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and sea of their own accord furnishes them with all things necessary for life.
This may have to do with his own life experience, coming from humble beginnings and moving through a British society that was very, very structured along class lines.
In Aboriginal lifestyle, as opposed to that, as Cook was witness to and reflected upon favourably, everybody was the same.
Cook's startling observations on the Gugu Yimithir will be edited out of the published version of his journal. Inequality of condition? Aborigines happier than Europeans. The 18th century establishment won't have its heroes flirting with radical politics. At last, on August the 4th, 1770, Cook says goodbye to these intriguing people. He then navigates the patched-up Endeavour out through the maze of the Great Barrier Reef. It is an astonishing feat of sailing. 18 days later, Cook lands once more and now performs one of the most controversial acts of the whole voyage. He claims the entire east coast of New Holland for Britain. He names it New South Wales.
We know the secret orders that Cook was given before he left Britain. That was to take possession of the Great South Land on 2 counts. One, that it was uninhabited, and which he'd sailed up the east coast and clearly it was not uninhabited. Or secondly, he was to open up dialogue with the native people and gain their consent, again, which he did not do.
But of course, Cook is a servant of the British Empire, and the hope was that he could steal an advantage over other possible national rivals, particularly, of course, the French.
What happened there was totally illegal. And you could basically say it was a theft of this continent from Indigenous people, and is still today illegal.
23rd of August 1770, Cook sails north into open water and back onto the map. Endeavour has finally rejoined the known world. She's heading for the Dutch port of Batavia, now called Jakarta. It had been over 2 years since the Endeavour had been anywhere even remotely European. But Batavia was a cesspit. The Dutch had rebuilt it in 1619 around a system of canals like those in Holland. Not a great idea in the tropics. The water in them oozed with green slime and sewage, breeding clouds of deadly mosquitoes. It was so bad, the Endeavour crew could smell Batavia long before they saw it. But Cook had no choice. It was the only place he could reach with a dry dock. He desperately needed that to repair Endeavour and get her home to England. Not long after they arrived, disease struck. It was James Cook's worst nightmare. Men he'd kept alive for 2.5 years began to die. Among the first, Tupaia, the Polynesian who's guided them through the South Seas. He's drawn detailed maps of the Pacific, acted as translator, teacher, diplomat. The words "departed this life" will soon fill Cook's journal. After the repairs to Endeavour are finished, she takes on water and leaves. They don't know it yet, but that water's infected, and now the dying begins in earnest. Among the first to die, Sidney Parkinson, ship's artist. This is his cabin. The 1,000 drawings by this quiet Quaker will show the world wonders. He was only 25 years old. The next 5 months see the relentless march of death through every section of the ship. Charles Green, astronomer. Mr. Sporing, ship's naturalist. Jonathan Monkhouse, whose idea to slip a sail under the damaged belly of Endeavour had saved everyone's lives. His brother, William Monkhouse, ship's surgeon. March 13th, 1771. By now, Cook's lost over a third of his men. There are barely enough left to sail the ship into port.
So close to home, having taken his crew around the world without losing a single man to disease. James Cook is now sailing a death ship.
Such was the despondency that reigned among the sick at this time, that a man was no sooner taken with it than he looked upon himself as dead.
We all know how exploration narratives run. You suffer, and then you get back to civilization. They hadn't suffered until they got back to civilization. It's like they really should never have come back. They should have stayed out there.
They'd all got to know each other one way or the other over a long period of time. And so good friends would have died. I think this must have had a big impact on Cook as well.
As Cook buries the last of his men, he has no way of knowing that back in London, his only daughter Elizabeth has also just died. 4 years old, the second child his wife has had to bury alone. Elizabeth has no idea when or if her husband will ever return.
I've got children of my own, so the thought of Elizabeth mourning her little ones by herself really tugs at my heart. She buried 2 of them here at St Dunstan's Church, not far from the family home at Mile End, baby Joseph and her namesake, the infant Elizabeth. Canny and pragmatic, she was raised in an alehouse near the Thames, so knew what she was in for, marrying a sailor. But James Cook was no ordinary sailor. In 16 years of marriage, they spent just 4 years together. If James Cook was exceptional, he needed a wife who was every bit as tough and determined to hold their family together. Theirs really was a partnership, despite the long years of separation. In her own way, she was just as remarkable as him.
July the 12th, 1771, after 2 years and 11 months at sea, Endeavour sights the white cliffs of Dover. Britain's great scientific voyage of discovery is finally over. The small world on board Endeavour is no longer Cook's home. He arrives back to the same bustling, chaotic, dirty city he had left. London hasn't changed, but he certainly has.
Cook doesn't go straight home to his family. He comes here, to his masters at the Admiralty.
3 years ago, he had arrived here as an unknown ship's master and was offered command of Endeavour. Now he's handing over his precious logs and journals, materials on which he'll be judged.
Among those logs and journals are plans he's made for a second, more audacious voyage. And it's in those plans that we can see his growing confidence and his obsession. He's only just arrived home, and now he wants to go again.
That's one of those things that sets him apart. He does incredibly well, but without a blink of an eye, he wants to get back at sea.
Cook had developed the confidence, he'd developed the knowledge of the Pacific in his own mind, and we can see this even in his first voyage journal, to determine once and for all whether there was a great southern land.
At last, James Cook heads home to Mile End with the ship's goat that's currently more famous than him. She circled the world twice, but finally has been granted retirement from the Navy. She'll now provide milk for Elizabeth and the children. He's expecting 4 children, but there's only two, young James and Nathaniel. Does he now tell Elizabeth about his plans to go away again? Does he give her 3 years of letters from a different world, a private world, just for her? They'd be the log of his personal journey, but they'll remain a tantalising mystery.
In the grand scheme of things, the voyage has been a huge success. Notwithstanding the problem observing the transit of Venus, and that was hardly his fault, there are his exquisite charts and maps of New Zealand and Australia, 2 new lands he's added to the empire, not to mention vast tracts of the Pacific Ocean. A natural history collection so large and strange, it'll take years to catalogue. James Cook should be the talk of the town, but the spotlight falls on someone else, someone who was, quite literally, born to it.
Joseph Banks is the real star of the voyage. King George III grants him an audience, and it's announced that the great scientist is to have 2 ships to pursue more discoveries in the South Seas. But the people who matter are aware of Cook's genius, and he'll soon be rewarded. A month after James's return, the Cook household at last receives good news. The Lords of the Admiralty have seen Cook's logs and maps, and they think he's breathtaking. Cook is now granted his own audience with the King and is promoted to Commander. Once again, his star is on the rise. After his promotion, Cook sits in his favourite coffee shop and writes a flattering letter to Joseph Banks.
The reputation I may have acquired calls to mind the very great assistance that I received from you.
James Cook wanted to command Banks's next voyage, and he'd do whatever it would take. Because this wouldn't be just any old voyage. This would be a voyage to determine the shape of the world.
On his first voyage, Cook had sailed south from Tahiti, adding New Zealand and the east coast of Australia to the world map. But there's still a massive blank to the south. Many people, including Joseph Banks, still believe it contains the fabled Great Southern Continent. Cook knows he's the right man to look for it.
I think it would be a great pity that this thing, which has been the object of many ages, should not now be wholly cleared up, which might very easily be done, as the navigator would know where to go to look for it.
This is the chart he submitted to the Admiralty. He's drawn here in yellow the route he intends to take.
As for a southern continent, I do not believe any such thing exists.
James Cook doesn't expect to find the Great Southern Continent, but he knows this voyage will allow him to do something which, to him, is even more satisfying: to fill in the chart of the world's largest ocean.
If no continent was to be found, the navigator might turn his thoughts towards the discovery of those islands within the tropical regions. This would make his discoveries more perfect and complete.
As he hopes, the Admiralty gives him command of Joseph Banks's voyage. Cook throws himself into preparations, but this time he has something else to consider. Joseph Banks likes to travel in comfort. He plans to bring servants, musicians, and apparently even his mistress, disguised as a man.
To accommodate them, he demands an extra deck on top of the ship, making it dangerously top-heavy. Cook knows the whole plan is crazy, but he doesn't say a word. The ship is clearly unseaworthy, and the Navy orders the alterations to be removed.
Soon afterwards, Joseph Banks visits his ship, watched by midshipman John Elliot.
Mr. Banks swore and stamped upon the wharf like a madman, and instantly ordered all his servants and all his things out of the ship.
Joseph Banks and James Cook never sailed together again. It was the end of what might have been one of the greatest exploration partnerships in history. Think about it though, James Cook had played a canny game. Mindful of his lower status, he'd hung back and let Joseph Banks shoot himself in the foot. On June 16th, 1772, Elizabeth gives birth to George, their 5th child. Just 5 days later, he says goodbye to Elizabeth and the children. He's going to the other side of the world, and he might never return. A year to the day after he brought Endeavour home, James Cook once more leaves Plymouth. After his close shave on the Barrier Reef, he's now taking 2 ships, more sturdy Whitby cats. He commands Resolution. Her sister ship is Adventure. It's commanded by Tobias Furneaux, at 36 years old, an experienced seaman who's already sailed around the world. But this is a much tougher task. Keeping up with James Cook.
James Cook's maps of the lands he's claimed are so accurate, they've helped Britain become the world's largest and most powerful empire. Now he's on a voyage that he says will make his previous discoveries more perfect and complete. More perfect and complete. That choice of words is really interesting. It gives us a valuable insight into his determination and his obsession. And there's something else. The Admiralty wants the great navigator to play his part in a grand experiment.
Greenwich Observatory is the centre of the world for British navigators in the 18th century. It's literally where the lines of longitude on Earth begin.
Latitude is fixed. London's at 51 degrees, and that's that. End of story. But longitude has to start somewhere, and the decision about where to start it is purely political. The world's most powerful nation gets to make that decision. In geographical terms, this telescope is the most powerful instrument in the world. Directly in line with the eyepiece, marked on the floor, is the line. This is it, 0 longitude. This brass line runs across the floor, up the wall, and outside the building. It then takes a leap into the imagination and runs completely around the Earth to come back and join itself here.
The Earth is divided by many such imaginary lines of longitude. The trick in the 18th century is how to measure where you are in relation to them. The simplest way is to sail with a clock set exactly on Greenwich time. When it's midday where you are, and you can tell that from the position of the sun, you then compare that with the time on the Greenwich clock. Every hour's difference is equal to 15 degrees of longitude east or west of Greenwich. Simple enough, but it demands a clock so reliable, no one's been able to make it.
This brings us to John Harrison, the man we can comfortably describe as a genius. His passion was making clocks. John Harrison set himself the task of making a hyper-accurate mechanical clock that would work on a rocking ship in tropical heat and polar cold. He was completely self-taught, and the task he set himself was, everyone said, utterly impossible. For John Harrison, it was the beginning of a lifetime obsession. Here's his first clock. It took 4 men to lift it.
Harrison perfected his clocks over 40 years, making them smaller and more accurate.
This is Harrison's fourth clock, the greatest navigational instrument ever made. This is the clock that James Cook is carrying on board Resolution.
Cook is going to test Harrison's clock to see if it can indeed solve the problems of measuring longitude. James Cook is in his element. He's never better than he is now, utterly in control in a way he never can be on land. By contrast, there's little his wife Elizabeth can do to control her world. 3 months after James leaves England, their baby son George dies. The third child, Elizabeth, will mourn alone. It'll be nearly 3 years before she can share her grief with her husband. A world away in the Southern Ocean, the men of Resolution and Adventure enter a world of ice. It's now January 1773.
Admiration and horror. The first is occasioned by the beautifulness of the picture, and the latter by the danger, and can only be described by the hand of an able painter.
The able painter is 29-year-old ship's artist, William Hodges. He'll show the world wonders like these. The very first images of the Antarctic.
At 14 past 11 o'clock, we pass the Antarctic Circle and are undoubtedly the first and only ship that ever crossed that line.
Notice he doesn't say ships. Fano and the Adventure are conveniently ignored. This is Cook's dream. Why share it?
Something happened to Cook on this second voyage. His plan was to prove something wasn't there, that the great southern continent didn't exist, at least not the romantic land of milk and honey. But he also wanted to prove a point. Stung by criticism that he hadn't gone far enough on his first voyage, he took his tiny wooden sailing ships deep into a frozen wasteland, testing them to the limits, not just once or twice, but over and over again. This obsessive man with a plan, the man who prided himself on looking after his crews, pushed himself and them to the brink of destruction.
This ship didn't have fires or heaters, so everybody was chilled to the bone all the time. Cook provided warm overcoats, fearnoughts they were called, but even they wouldn't keep out the Arctic chill. So for months at a time, sailors who were mostly barefooted and had no gloves were trying to work the ship in Arctic and subarctic temperatures.
Resolution and Adventure are separated in thick fog. While James Cook searches for the great southern continent, Tobias Fano takes the Adventure north to Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania. At the time, no one knows if Van Diemen's Land is joined to Australia. Fano tries to find out, but is turned away by bad weather. He then sails for a place James Cook knows well, Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand. Meanwhile, James Cook continues his sweep of the Southern Ocean and then also turns for Queen Charlotte Sound. He's been at sea for 122 days and 17,000 kilometres without ever sighting land. These days, the ferry from Wellington takes me through Queen Charlotte Sound, much of it still as beautiful as James Cook would have seen it. When he first arrived here with Endeavour, James Cook made hundreds of astronomical observations to determine his longitude. Now he checks these against John Harrison's clock. It's very accurate. Cook had been sceptical about the clock, but now he's a convert to his so-called trusty friend. The experiment has been a success. The Harrison clocks, or chronometers, are the start of a new era in navigation, in which sailors no longer need to be mathematical geniuses like James Cook to calculate their longitude. This is his second time in New Zealand, and he's worried about the effects of their visits on the Maori.
For a spike nail or any other thing they value, they will oblige their wives and daughters to prostitute themselves. We debauch their morals and we introduce among them diseases which they never before knew. If anyone denies the truth of this, let him tell me what the natives of the old extent of America have gained by the commerce they have had with Europeans.
Cook knew that contact between his crews and indigenous peoples could lead to trouble, could lead, of course, to quarrels over women.
He's serving on a ship almost entirely populated by sailors whose attitude to prostitution is, if you have some money, you can buy some booze and some girls. He's pretty much the only person on the ship who has a problem with this.
It's almost as if he's disappointed that his men have been able to corrupt the Maori he respects so much. He's certainly growing anxious and irritable, and he wants to get underway. I think he knows, perhaps, that he'll only feel happy when he's at sea on board his ship, where he can contain and control not only his men, but his whole world.
Cook leaves New Zealand in the southern winter of 1773 to continue the search for the great southern continent. It's too cold to go south, so he begins a huge loop of the Central Pacific. But adventure is slowing him down. Unlike the fastidious, obsessive Cook, Tobias Furneaux isn't looking after his men's diet. Adventure is rife with scurvy.
This is a typical day's ration for a sailor. A pound of hardtack biscuit, a pound of salt pork, half a pound of cereal, in this case, mushy peas, and wait for it, a gallon of beer. Now, this will give you the calories that you need, but it won't give you the vitamin C, and without vitamin C, you get scurvy. Scurvy killed more sailors in the 18th century than war, accidents and shipwrecks combined. If you were going on a large voyage, you needed double the amount of crew you thought you needed because half were expected to die along the way. And it's a horrible way to die. Firstly, your gums start to bleed, then your teeth fall out. Old wounds start to reopen, bones that were previously healed re-break. Your mucous membranes start to bleed and then your body swells up black and blue until you're lying there praying to die in agony. Tragedy is, it's simple to avoid scurvy with vitamin C. There's enough vitamin C in these 2 bottles to keep a ship's crew of 100 men scurvy-free for a year. Trouble was, back in James Cook's day, nobody knew about it.
Cook was so anxious to solve the problem that he took on board every possible idea that anybody had had as to what might cure it.
His attention to the health of his men that really, in my eyes, sets him apart. Not only in the diet that they were to be given on ship to ward off scurvy, a mixture of malt beer, orange peel, of pickled cabbage, famous sauerkraut. He also kept the ships very clean and tidy. In all of his voyages, he lost no men to scurvy.
July 17, filling in the blanks, expunging rumours of where the great southern continent might lie. He finds nothing and then turns north towards Tahiti, and I think the real purpose of his voyage. To meticulously chart the reality of the South Pacific, rather than look for something he doesn't believe exists. William Hodges paints beautiful views of Tahiti. But Cook sees beyond the vision of paradise. He's again concerned about his men's mistreatment of the local women. When some of his men make too free with the women, in other words, rape them, he has them flogged.
The men didn't mind being beaten as long as they got beaten for the same thing every time. What they didn't like was captains who were inconsistent, capricious, spiteful. What they liked was fair, solid, honest treatment. If you were a popular captain, if the men liked and respected you, if you were consistent and fair, they'd come back. Cook's men always came back.
As they're leaving, Tobias Furneaux takes a young Tahitian on board. Mai is going to become a superstar of London society. Joseph Banks had tried to do the same thing 4 years earlier, but Tupaia died en route to England. Right now, James Cook is thinking about that Polynesian priest and navigator. Cook has brought lots of charts with him, some of them accurate, some of them fanciful. But the most remarkable is one drawn from Tupaia's information.
Tupaia's knowledge stretches across some 2,200 kilometres of ocean. Look here, he's marked down an island, Moatanao. Cook sails there and finds it, though he renames it Harvey Island. Here, towards the edge of the chart, is another island. He's called Ohetapoto. Cook sails there, and again, he finds it. He renames this one Savage Island. Cook then runs out of chart. Now, this map is from the great Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, drawn some 130 years beforehand. Check out these two islands, Amsterdam and Middelburg. Cook sails to these islands and finds them too. What he does next is to combine the two charts into one accurate map. Now, that seems an obvious thing to do, but what it does do is give us an extraordinary insight into the way Cook's mind works. Here you have two navigators, Abel Tasman and Tupaia, whom many in the 18th century would have regarded as a half-naked savage, regarded by Cook as equals, regardless of race or class.
Cook's obsessive charting will amaze his superiors back at the Admiralty. They'll marvel at his passion for going well beyond their orders in this hunt for the great southern continent. After 4 months map-making across the Pacific, Resolution and Adventure sail once more for New Zealand and Queen Charlotte Sound. James Cook and Resolution arrive alone. This leads to one of the most poignant events of any of Cook's voyages. I've arranged to meet John Robson, a Cook historian who knows all about it.
Do you think he was as happy disproving this idea of the Great Southern Continent, so proving a negative?
I think for Cook, it was an academic process. If there was land there, he would find it.
Cook waits at Queen Charlotte Sound for Furneaux and the Adventure for almost a month, but he's anxious to continue his search. In late November 1773, he sails south once again. Just 5 days after Cook leaves, Tobias Furneaux arrives with the Adventure.
Wow, we've walked just 100 metres or so into the bush, and already that veneer of tranquility, of that idyllic landscape has been stripped away. This is really spooky. It's got a sense of danger to it.
Furneaux will never forget his visit here.
They needed some provisions, and Furneaux sent a small boat across the sound. Sadly, they didn't come back. The next day, he sent another boat, and they found the dismembered remains of their colleagues on the beach over there.
They'd been eaten.
They'd certainly been butchered, and I think it is that some of the boats were eaten as well.
It really did then rip the heart out of Furneaux's ambition to voyage.
And within a few days, the ship had left here, Within a few months, they were back in Britain.
James Cook has no way of knowing what's happened to Furneaux's men. He's far to the south, searching for the great southern continent. Cook's experiences in the freezing Southern Ocean are now believed to have been the inspiration for Samuel Taylor Coleridge's epic poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his o'ertaking wings and chased us south along, with sloping masts and dipping prow. As who pursued with yell and blow, the ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, the southward aye we fled. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice, mast high, came floating by, as green as emerald.
On January 13th, 1774, Cook sails into an impenetrable wall of ice. He's reached an incredible 71 degrees south. James Cook has finally found his limit.
I, whose ambition leads me not only farther than any other man has been before me, but as far as I think it possible for a man to go, was not sorry at meeting with this interruption.
James Cook turns resolution north. 15-year-old midshipman George Vancouver, destined to become a great explorer and navigator himself, climbs out onto the bowsprit in an attempt to go further south than anyone else on planet Earth. James Cook's second voyage was arguably the greatest journey of discovery of all time, although ironically it was probably more important for what he didn't find than what he did. He took the myth of the great southern continent and systematically removed it from the world map. In one magnificent voyage, this man, with the most basic of education, had taken a concept that intellectuals and philosophers had championed for thousands of years and completely exploded it. Their armchair speculation was no match for his relentless pursuit of the facts. It was a scientific triumph, but it was also a hollow one, though James Cook didn't know it yet. He'd achieved his ambition, but he'd paid a terrible price. The man who'd always wanted to be in control was falling apart.
He was suffering so greatly from his stomach that he was in a great sweat and could hardly stand. It was indeed hardly remarkable that, after so great a responsibility and so prodigious a strain on both his mental and physical capacities, he should be completely exhausted. And the sparman, HMS Resolution.
Cook's become seriously ill with what he calls the bilious colic. The ship's surgeon feeds him the only fresh meat on board, a pet dog, now duly sacrificed and made into a broth.
Thus, I received nourishment and strength from food which would have made most people in Europe sick.
He's so ill, many think he's dying, but Cook sticks to his plan. April 1774, he turns west, a great loop across the Pacific to the New Hebrides and New Caledonia, the tiny speck of Norfolk Island, and a week later, Queen Charlotte Sound. It must have felt like home. Through James Cook's efforts, the vast blank that was the Pacific Ocean is now being filled in by the steady hand of this master chartmaker. But the growing sense of order on the chart contrasts the growing disorder in his temper. Increasingly unpredictable, this new Cook is a far cry from the controlled man his crew is used to. He could now head straight back to England, but he's not finished yet. Amazingly, he makes one final push across the freezing waters of the South Atlantic. He finds South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, but no continent. Of course, there is a great southern continent. It's called Antarctica. Cook never saw it, but he knew if it existed, it wasn't the rich land of the myth.
A country doomed by nature to lie forever buried under everlasting snow and ice.
There's a pattern to the second voyage, and it's basically to establish with 3 sweeps as near as he can get down to Antarctica, that firstly it doesn't exist in the Indian Ocean, secondly it doesn't exist in the Pacific Ocean, and thirdly it doesn't exist in the Atlantic Ocean.
He sails through speculation, he blows these myths out of the water, he sets down the most accurate chart yet completed of the Southern Atlantic and the Southern Pacific.
James Cook has been 3 years and 18 days defining the shape of the world.
Thus, I flatter myself that the intention of the voyage has in every respect been fully answered, and the Southern Hemisphere sufficiently explored, and a final end put to the searching after a southern continent.
Cook has achieved his ambition, to go as far as it is possible for a man to go. But has he pushed himself too far? William Hodges paints Cook's first known portrait. Not a noble, triumphant hero, but a dark portrait of an ambitious, obsessive.
That ambition has come at a price. Physically and mentally, flaws are beginning to show in this discovering genius. Flaws that will ultimately lead to his death.